Peter Brabeck-Letmathe, the Chairman of the Board of Nestlé. Water, the topic title, sir, is A Thirst for Growth. Your perspectives and overview on this issue, please.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Thank you for inviting me here. I know we're a little bit late on the thing, so I will try to be very short on those. I mean, the question is, will water risk be a limit really to growth? And I think to give an answer to this question, we have to realize how important water has been for the growth in the past. And I will try with 4 charts to show you why I think this is perhaps the most important issue for the further growth, economic growth, but also social growth. If I go back and I have a first look on why and how water has been helping to drive the growth in prosperity, you see here a short chart. Basically shows you since 1950 how many people we were on Earth, how many we are today. 2005, I took 2005. You see we have been multiplying by 2.5. If you look at the water for household, we have been multiplying by 2.9. That shows that there is an over-dimensional growth on the water consumption, household consumption. If you then look at the grain output, you see we have multiplied this by 3.4. This is a sign that we have had more caloric intake per person, for example. And of course, this has to do with water usage. And people getting enough to eat, you see that there was a huge increase by 5.3%. This comes, as I said before, from producing more of those. And then when we are looking at the energy part, and it was just discussed a lot, you see that electricity, for example, from thermal plants have improved by 6.3 times. But the water for the thermal use, which was not discussed in the whole energy discussion, by the way, it is about 40 times as much water has been used in order to produce the amount of energy. Now, what it means is that on the one side, which is the social side, you can see that with the increased water usage, we have been able to improve the quality of life, global expectancy, from 47 years to 68 years, which I think is quite an outstanding achievement. And on the other hand, you see also an outstanding achievement that the GDP of the world has been increased substantially. As a matter of fact, from 1,990 in 1950 to 6,930. So the important message which I want to leave with you is that this was possible by an ever-increasing water usage. And we could use more water because water is a fixed amount that is available. And as we were only 2.5 million people, there was absolutely enough water. We didn't have to think about it. Now, this has changed, and this takes me to the next slide. This has changed quite a lot. If I put now 2050 and then put it to 1950, you see already that if I put together what we needed for the agriculture in order to produce this more food, if I look what I needed for the industry and for energy production, and finally the household, which I have showed you in details before, you see that in 2005 already, for the first time, we have been using much more water that is sustainably available for our humankind usage of water. And we have, for the first time since 2005, are we using non-sustainable water in the sense that we are taking away the water from somebody else. Basically, we take it away from the environment. That's the reason why the Aral Lake is just a small pond with what was before. Lake of Chad, 25,000 square kilometers to 2,500. The water levels falling down in China, in the Punjab, in the big agricultural sectors, but also, of course, in the US. Now, on the next one, we made an estimate in the Water Resource Group, which is a public-private partnership that we have created over the last couple of years, together with some other companies, NGOs, and the World Bank and the IFC. We have analyzed the 154 water basins of the world, and we have looked at the demand side. And what you see here is that the crisis which we have started 5 years ago is going to move into an absolutely unsustainable crisis. It means that if you would ask me what is going to be the biggest blockage for growth in the world, and so both social growth, but also economic growth, it's going to be water. You will not have the water that you need in order to produce the energy you were just talking about. For example, last year I had the privilege to be in China when, in the summertime, there was not enough water to keep 54 of the coal electricity plants running, which had as an incidence that, of course, everybody in the factory in China had to put on the generator, which had an incidence that the diesel price and the diesel demand went up so highly that there was a 7% diesel failure in the total diesel supply. And the Chinese government is absolutely convinced, Prime Minister says, the future of the China, the economic development, depends how we can really settle the water issue. Without water, there will be no economic growth. This is the most important choking point for the economy that we have. And of course, it's also going to have enormous impact on the social side, because it is quite clear that we will not have sufficient water in order to produce the food that we need in order to supply the another 3 billion of people which are waiting for us to come. I will perhaps show and stop with a more positive message. The positive message is that after having analyzed the water basins, we have also established for each one of those water basins solutions in order to balance the sustainable water withdrawal with economic growth. And we have established a catalog of about 240 different leverages which we can implement in order to establish this. That's a good news. The good news is that there are sufficient possibilities in order to bring the water usage to a balance. But it needs, very clearly, it needs political decisions. It needs a better understanding on how important this water supply is in order to assure the long-term things. Those issues are, for example, reduced tillages, laser land leveling to reduce runoff and better drain lands, seeds for higher yields. Again, technology plays a very important role in this area. So basically, that's all what I wanted to share with you. I think it is clear that if we are not tackling this issue, which is not an issue of the next 100 years, you know, we can talk about climate change and climate variation and whatever, yeah, and even CO2. But this problem is not for the next 100 years, the problem is of today. We are already using today much too much water. Any one of our new technologies that we have, whether it's on the energy side, it has a multiplying effect on the demand of water. I'll give you just one figure. I mean, in the past, we needed about 1/10 of the oil production for the water. Today, you need 3 barrels for water, 4 barrels, 6 barrels for water to produce 1 barrel of oil. And on the food side also, we have lost basically the technological advantages which we had built up over the last 30 years. And today, as you saw from the picture, for every 1 calorie, whether it's on the food side or whether it's on the energy side, we are needing more water than we did in the past. More water which we don't have. And I think I'll stop here.
Peter, thank you so much for that. If you take a seat at the end of the table. Particularly for your remarks which start to link water to the food and water to the energy. We'll come back to that. We had some questions earlier on biofuel. I'd be particularly interested in you to offer some thoughts. So I can invite the rest of our panel quickly to join us. That is Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, who's the Minister of Environment and Water Resources for Singapore. So you're next to Mr. Brabeck. Glen Daigger, who's the Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer for CH2M Hill. You're next in the queue. Professor David Gray, Visiting Professor of Water Policy at Oxford University, and Professor Jim Hall, Director of the Environmental Change Unit at Oxford. Welcome, gentlemen, to this conversation. I know that we are pressed for time, and this is such an interesting and complex issue, and as Peter has done extremely well, he's immediately placed this water as a choke point on economic growth in the context of both food and energy. Peter, I would like to come back to you on the biofuel question in a second, but Minister, does the sort of sketch that Peter has has set out resonate for you trying to manage these issues within Singapore?
Absolutely. I'm really glad you've set the context and I think set the alarm bells ringing for water. And what I thought I would share is the perspective from Singapore, from a policymaker's perspective. For a country that has always had to deal with water as a critical strategic constraint. In 1942, the British surrendered Singapore to the Japanese. Of course, there were many reasons for that. One key reason was the Japanese captured all our reservoirs. Singapore then and today continues to depend on 50% of our water imported from Johor. Another point, when we were given independence in 1965, we are probably the only country in the world where our Declaration of Independence has stapled to it 2 annexes, the water agreements with Malaysia, to guarantee us a supply of water for 50 years for the first agreement and 99 years for the second agreement. I said all this out so you understand how much of an existentialist issue it is for us. And for a long while, we assumed that water was the key limiting factor for our potential growth. I just wanted to make 3 points today. 1, the need for long-term plans. 2, technology breakthroughs. 3, pricing. First, on long-term plans. If you've been to Singapore, we're very, very small, 700 square kilometers, smaller than the city of London. But we've got 5 million people stacked into this place. We don't have hydroelectricity, we don't have energy, we've got nothing except people and a thirst for water. When I say long-term plans, we've built reservoirs, we've built reclamation projects, we've done everything, bearing in mind the fact that our water supplies agreements were going to expire in 50 years, in 99 years. So in the case of Singapore, every water project that we do does not depend on the electoral cycle of 4 or 5 years, but on the long term. Secondly, when we've reclaimed land, and we've reclaimed at least 25% of our land, we've always reclaimed with a view to building infrastructure for water, which means the additional land is both a catchment as well as a storage for water. Thirdly, if you go to Singapore today, every drain, every street, every rooftop on which rain falls leads ultimately to a reservoir, which we then treat and then supply as potable water to our people. So the first point, the easy point I'm trying to make is there has to be a long-term plan and a long-term horizon on the part of your planners. Second, technology. The greatest breakthrough for Singapore occurred about a decade ago when reverse osmosis became commercially available and viable. Before that, we were entirely dependent on surface runoff and on imported water. With reverse osmosis, today Singapore produces 10% of our needs from desalination, another 30% from recycling used water. By 2060, we will depend on reverse osmosis for 80% of our water. Now, reverse osmosis basically means the water equation for a city-state like Singapore is now totally dependent on energy. Today, it takes us about 3.5 kilowatt hour to produce 1 cubic meter of water desalinated. We are embarking on further projects to try to halve that energy requirement. The point is energy equals water. Next point is that there is therefore a need for governments to provide the support for the R&D into technology. Singapore didn't invent reverse osmosis. Nevertheless, we provided a test bed for a prototype to demonstrate that on a national or on a citywide basis, this technology could be applied sensibly and rationally. We are, in other words, providing a prototype of the future. The third point is on pricing, which is really where the political meat is. In the case of Singapore, our policy is to charge water at the long-run marginal cost of the next available drop. In the case of Singapore, if you've listened to my earlier presentation, the next available drop is desalination. So today, everyone in Singapore pays a minimum price which covers the long-run marginal cost of desalination without subsidies, without rent collection. But by doing it efficiently and using the latest available technology, we are able basically to price water at about £1 for 1 ton of water. Portable, at the tap, safe to drink. Now, that would be politically difficult to do because everyone will say, well, water is a basic human right. And there will always be poor families and people who need help. We deliberately eschew subsidies for price, but instead we give cold hard cash to lower income families so that they can then use that cash to purchase energy, transport, or water. So there is a way to charge the right prices, to send a signal that water is a scarce and precious resource, equally to send a signal to the private sector that it is worth investing in long-term projects in Singapore because they are bankable. Your cash flow is virtually guaranteed, or as long as these policies prevail. But it is essential then, if you're not going to run subsidies on natural resources, that you have a government that's able to generate on an ongoing basis budget surpluses, which can then, some part of that, be handed as cold hard cash to people who need help. This is a far more efficient and I would say economically rational way of ensuring that essential resources are right priced and yet universally accessible to everyone who needs it. So that's my spiel. Long-range planning, appropriate use of technology, and get the price right, and eschew subsidies. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much for a very practical and very succinct kind of overview of a very, very interesting with a very, very interesting example in there, which is always good to focus on. Glen, I'm going to come to you in a second, because some of those elements that the Minister set out must be music to your ears, and I'd be interested in where else you see that happening. But before I do, I will, Peter, turn back to you. I know that you might have to leave us before roughly the panel is finished, but one thing that did come through from your overview was this issue of biofuels. Peter Brabeck hardly touched on biofuels. Could he comment on the sensibility of subsidising and mandating biofuels? And related to that, this idea that when you were talking about electricity, but there are dry cooling options, is water really a choke point to economic growth and energy, or is it more just a bump in the road, was the question. I'd be interested in your reflections on those 2 points for our audience.
Well, first of all, on the question of biofuels, I mean, I think this was a single most important decision that has been taken during the last 5 years. And it was taken because of a silo mentality. People had into mind basically the question about CO2, and then the idea was we replace it by renewable and biomass. That sounds great, and biofuel sounds, it's like life, you know, bio is considered life, so it sounds beautiful. So that's the right solution to do. Okay? Politically great. The reality was that behind all that time was in reality a question about how you get more subsidies to the farmer community, which was in danger because of the Doha round. Okay? That was perhaps a political side to it. But what people didn't understand, and still I don't think they understand, is that the food market and the energy market is the same market. Both of them are calories. Now, the difference is that we need 2,500 calories as an average in order to assure our human life, but we need 50,000 calories in order to achieve the transport, the heating, the thing, and all what we need from the energy side. So when you have a market, the same market, and the one is 20 times bigger than the other one, and then you have politicians saying, and we want now to replace 20% of the 20 times bigger markets with the smaller one, you don't have to be a genius to make the calculation. At least those who are working in the financial markets, they saw that very clear, that this would mean you would have to triple the food production in order to come up with what the politicians put forward as a target. And that enclenched, of course, the incredible increase of the food prices in 2007, 2008. Okay? So for me, this fundamental issue, as long as we don't get this ingrained and the people understand it, that the food market and the energy market is the same market, And you cannot play around with the bigger one without considering what's the impact. That's the first thing. The second one is what the minister was just saying. As long as we do not give value, and I'm not even saying price, value to water, and there are different ways to give value to water, we will continue to make things like biofuels. You need 9,100 liters of water to produce 1 liter of biodiesel. Now, if we would give any value to this thing, we wouldn't be doing it. But of course, as the water for agricultural production is absolutely cost-free, or in the worst of the cases, it costs you 2%, like in Spain and in Italy, of the real value that they are using, well, we make those aberrations. And we are taking away, once more, water from where we need it really the most, which is, first of all, in order to assure the supply chain. So therefore, my call is very simple. I'm not against biofuel, if you want to call it. I think it's wrongly called anyway. But what I am absolutely against is to use food for fuel. And if we only would come to this one simple decision, no food for fuel, we would be stabilizing the prices of the agricultural raw materials immediately, and we would have an option then afterwards to work efficiently through innovation and technology in order to bring this balance again, which I talked before.
Thank you very much for that overview, which clearly resonates with our panel. Minister, just quickly.
To echo and to support what you've just said, I speak as a victim of wrong-headed thinking for subsidies for biofuel. In the case of Singapore, because of subsidies, parts of Southeast Asian peatland and forests are being burnt in order to plant crops to generate biofuels. This does not save carbon. In fact, it releases far more carbon into the atmosphere. The point which I want to emphasize today is that it's all about energy. Energy equals water and equals food. And it would work as long as there's no wrong-headed, mistargeted subsidies distorting equations and distorting decision-making. So I completely support what you've said. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. This is landing us very helpfully, because you can see here, it doesn't need me to spell this out for you, some of the linkages with the earlier panels. Glen, there's a lot there to chew on, and we never have much time to do all the proper chewing, but the question that comes through, which might be helpful to you, C.H. Turnhill, a leader in this space and on the water infrastructure sector, question says, the Singapore example is inspiring, but how realistic is this for other countries, and particularly larger countries? Do you see this market expanding and booming? Is this good for your business? What's your viewpoint?
Absolutely, in terms of, is the example of Singapore good for our business, but good for the water sector? We need these examples, and it's very interesting. At the Singapore Water Week last year, your Prime Minister was asked, a question, was really a statement. It was, well, yes, Singapore can do it, but Singapore is rich. How can others do it? And there was two answers, two components of the answer, is that we haven't always been rich, but we've always valued water. The second one was looking at other places around the world, and there are many places around the world where the principles, and here is an important point, the confusion that people have between what is done in one local situation versus the principles that are applied. Because one of the things about water is that it is local. The provision of service and the provision of technology is at least regional or global, but the solutions are local. So let's look at some of the important principles that have to be applied in any particular location, many of which have already been articulated here. First of all, water has value. As Peter has really described, water is actually economical because the absence of an effective water management system costs more in terms of the economy than the cost to implement it. So water management is a bargain. And it's those that realize it, such as Singapore, but many other countries around the world, benefit from it by putting in place an effective system. That means that you have to pay for it. So a key is paying for it. The second then is to look at the local situation, to look at the water resources that are available, and then to pull from the toolkit. Sometimes the toolkit is desalination. Some elements that are almost always a part of the toolkit are efficiency, recycle and reuse, and increasingly local rainwater capture. So we have a toolkit that allows us to actually look at the hydrology of the local area, pull from that toolkit, and then put together the most effective solution in a systematic fashion. So it's looking at the water cycle, whether you're looking at an urban area or a water basin. It's looking at the natural hydrology of that location, and then pulling from the toolkit to develop an integrated solution and then implementing it. So those are some of the keys. There are many locations around the world where that is being done. The result is those locations enjoy the economic, the social, the environmental benefits. We just need to be doing this in a lot more places.
Where else stands out for you as another location where things are happening which seem positive in your perspective?
If we look at, let me kind of go regionally, but two of the really shining examples in Asia are Phnom Penh in Cambodia. The Philippines is progressing quite nicely. There are very good examples in China. China is a big place, so there are a number of good examples in China. Africa is surprising to people. Uganda is a great example. In the north, places like Morocco, Swaziland. In Europe, we have the Dutch water boards are really paint the way forward, and a number of the German water boards. In the United States, we have places like San Antonio, Texas. I go to some of the dry areas first. San Antonio, Texas is an excellent example. Some of the wet areas, Philadelphia, Seattle, Portland. So the examples are all over.
So what's interesting here, in terms of the toolkit of principles and best practices, which perhaps was laid out from an economic perspective to begin with, and things can be done, provided there's that sort of clarity of policy and clarity around the subsidy issue. And there's some really bad examples of where non-integrated thinking can mess things up. What's interesting in terms of perhaps that implementation of the toolkit at the local level, as you said, Professor Gray, some of your work suggests, if I understand correctly, that if we don't implement at the local level, the ripple effects of some of the challenge actually do get to the global level in our interconnected economy.
Thank you, Dominic. There's a presumption that water is local. Water services are clearly local. Water resources are still perceived as sovereign. They're rivalrous. The word rival, by the way, rivus alis, means sharing a river with another. People on the opposite side of a river. I beg your pardon. Opposite side of a river. We live in a world where water is becoming increasingly global. Water resources in particular, water is a flux. It moves very slowly to very quickly. And the water flux, the global water flux, is changing because of the global carbon flux. And we don't know what the distribution of water will be 50 years from now as a consequence of that flux. We're seeing wetter places becoming drier and drier places becoming wetter. We're also, because of the trade in commodities and food, we're seeing massive shocks reverberate around the world. A couple of examples. Last year in Thailand, very heavy monsoon, floods through from the early spring until the fall. The economic cost of those floods, $45 billion. The insurance costs, about 15 to 20 billion, with over 2 billion of that being taken by Lloyd's of London, and that being a significant part of the net negative return that Lloyd's showed in last fiscal year. The computer supply chain, down for several months. Western Digital and Seagate are making most of their hard drives in Thailand. 7,500 factory sites underwater. A bit of a presumption that investors, multinationals investing in Thailand, were getting first world infrastructure and cheap labor, but a misunderstanding that weak institutions don't help, even if you have first world infrastructure. The Russian drought, 2010, a year earlier. Production fell by 45% in Russia, an export ban put in place in August, no wheat export. Prices spiking dramatically, I think 80% by the winter of that year. Food riots in the Middle East. Much of Russian export goes to the Middle East. Food riots in Tunisia in January and February. Paul Krugman himself said that the food prices were central in this social unrest that led to the Arab Spring. It's a trigger. I mean, there are multiple other dimensions to this, but a drought in Russia having significant impacts in the Middle East. So, and there are many other examples. There's a lot of stuff out there about the consequences of the Pakistan floods 2010 with a repeat in 2011 on Taliban recruitment because of the inability of government to provide the necessary support to flood victims. So the point that I'm trying to make here, and I hope I'm making it clearly, is that water is increasingly global. But water, unlike food and energy to some extent, is rivalrous. And we also have a situation where the poorest countries in the world live in the most difficult hydrological environments. They have very high variability. I mean, Africa and Europe have the same rainfall. 750 millimeters per year is about what Africa has and about what Europe has. But Europe gets it consistently, reliably spread through the year. Africa, the inside the year variability is massive. Many countries, as you will know, only have one short rainy season. And year-on-year variability can be as much as 40%. Typically in Europe, that's 12%. So a very difficult condition requiring massive infrastructure investments to manage in very poor countries that can't afford that infrastructure. So very large infrastructure gaps, and then very strong institutions needed to manage that infrastructure.
David, thank you very much. I'm rather taken with this idea of water as a sort of gossamer that's floating through the global economy, which you can sort of tug and have these unexpected linkages and changes in those supply chains that you were referring to, with the solution set, the toolkit, Glen, that you were referring to, an example perhaps from Singapore, happening in particular locations, very sort of specifically to specific situations. We could talk for a lot longer on this. There's so many kind of interactions that are emerging with the first two panels. Professor Hall, it falls to you really to close us out on this conversation, and maybe if you have reflections from the other two panels as well. But water here as the last of this food, energy, water play. What are your takeaways as the head of the Environmental Change Unit here at Oxford?
Well, I think we've had a very useful set of perspectives in our panel here, and before I try to draw some of those together, I'd like to at least provide one or two perspectives from the UK, which hasn't been mentioned on this water panel, but I think is instructive in at least two senses. I mean, the question we've been posed is, to what extent is water risk a limit to growth? And that might strike people as being a surprising question in the United Kingdom, where we live in a reasonably stable hydrological environment, though the Chancellor did draw our attention to the vagaries of that hydrology in his introduction this morning. But flooding is at near the top of the Cabinet Office's risk register. The 2007 floods resulted in about £3 billion worth of damage. The insurance industry estimate that a large flood could cost £10 billion in this country. And David referred to the linkages with the rest of the world in terms of our connection via the insurance market. Also, the UK is in the top 10 of importers of virtual water. In the other six of those other top 10 countries are in the Middle East. So we're unusually exposed with respect to dependence on the global food markets to substitute for our local water. And in the meantime, our local water bodies, only 25% of them are in good ecological status. So our relative security with respect to droughts has been achieved at the expense of the environment. And that environmental externality of water is one of the other things I'd like to draw attention to more broadly, that a lot of our water security worldwide has been achieved at the expense of ecosystem services. Just another quick lesson from the UK, however, is in terms of innovation in finance and ownership. There's a lot of interest in the discussions we've had here in the way in which new business models might lead to environmentally more benign outcomes. And in some senses, the UK is an example of that. The water industry was privatized in 1989. That led to a very large influx of finance, over £100 billion worth of finance. And that finance, very much of it, went on improving externalities, improving bathing water and river water quality, improved sewage treatment and wastewater treatment. And for the investors, that was a relatively risk-free, steady return on that 100 billion or so of investment. But it did have some undesirable side effects, in particular in relation to innovation, which is why what the minister has said has been so interesting. And so the UK is now well behind countries like Singapore, Australia, Israel, in terms of the amount of water-related innovation which is taking place. There's also been a considerable supply-side emphasis, whereas, and this is another message we've got from around the panel, we need to be managing water as an integrated system with emphasis across the piece on both demand and supply side. And the model we've adopted has ended up with a rather fragmented approach to managing water within silos. So, I mean, drawing some of the themes together from along this panel, we've heard from Mr. Brabeck that this is a challenge we're facing today. This isn't a future challenge, but the future will only get worse. 19% increase in water demand by the middle of the century. In low latitudes, 10 to 30% decrease in water availability. And those figures cover up what David Gray pointed to us, which is the importance of variability. It's in countries with the most variable hydrology that the impacts of water-related risks are felt most strongly. And the buffer against that variability, which is trade in water-intensive commodities, primarily food, as we've heard from the previous panel, is also becoming stretched. So the amount by which we can rely upon that buffer is in question in the future. And the responses we've had are in relation to innovation, in relation to data. We need to understand the water system much better than we do at the moment if we're going to manage it better. And in relation to partnerships, the minister has pointed to long-term planning. David Nabarro in his talk was talking about these very interesting emerging new sets of partnerships. And water is another instance where we need to be working in partnership. If we don't get the governance right, if we don't get the valuation of water right, then we're not going to exploit the potential of innovation.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you for bearing through and engaging with this sort of food, energy, water play. If I were to offer a couple of thoughts from across the panels, it is that I think we have deepened our understanding of the linkage points here. And this last exposition was very clear on the energy, water, food link with a very practical example, both from the business side and from the governmental side. This issue of the innovation and the technology and the policy, neither one first or second. There's going to be different in different places, but there's not one kind of shot at this. It's going to be modular. and this nature of these large-scale collaborative partnerships with governments, with private sector, with civil society, with academia, to kind of push through some of these challenges and create proof points. Whether it was in agriculture we heard from Peter on the water side, and there's certainly some with the sustainable energy for all emerging on the energy side, and how that links to the international discussions and multilateral frameworks is a very interesting new frontier that's opening up. So we shall close this panel with a round of applause for an excellent group of people.